Hey everyone and welcome to another KirbyCast. Today I want to give you a crash course into field development, and just yesterday Tuesday asked on Discord if we have a field similar to this. And we don't really have something like that, but I want to show you how to build one for yourself. It's not going to be a combination of margin and padding like in this example screenshot here, but I'm going to focus on a field that you could use either for margin or for padding. But let's just get started and I'm going to show you. I've already prepared a few things. So I've installed the plane kit and I've set up a new page for us to experiment with it, and I've already created a new demo YAML file for us to create the field blueprint setup for it. So it looks like this, and if we want to have our fields in action later, it should be something like this. So I would then probably use something like margin, and the type could be spacing, for example, and then I could have additional options. It's always a good idea to start with something like the blueprint setup or the content that you want to store to give you a better idea what you want to achieve. So the combination of the screenshot that we already have together with an idea how the architecture around it looks like is already a great starting point. And as a next step, I want to create the plugin. Going to my files. No, I haven't opened this correctly, so I'm going to do this in the Finder. This is the setup. There is my site folder, and all I have to do in the plugins folder, if it's not there yet, is to create a new folder called spacing. It's always a good idea to name the plugin or the folder for the plugin like you would name the field, for example, or just have consistency in the naming of the folder here. One thing that we need is okay, I'm going to open this one up in the editor quickly because this is actually helping me with a few other things later. And the first thing that I want to add to my folder is a new index.php, because this is the way to tell Kirby that this is a Kirby plugin, and we are going to use the Kirby namespace or demo namespace, whatever. So this is your developer name, and then the name of the field. This would be spacing or spacing fields. This is up to you. I'm sticking with spacing here. And we will want to create a new field, and that should also be called spacing. And we can simply create an empty array. So far, this is totally fine to get started. Now we tell Kirby there's going to be a new spacing field. The next one that we need is going to be an index.js, and inside we are creating a panel extension or a panel plugin, and this plugin starts in the same way. We have to give it a name with the combination of developer name and plugin name, and here again we tell the panel that there is going to be a spacing field. This definition of the spacing field is a view component later. And we have been looking into that with the blocks field extension just recently in a video. I'm going to explain it a bit more. This is a view component, as I said, so the definition here either needs to have a render function or a simple template function to tell Kirby what the field template looks like, basically the HTML for the field. So if we start with a very simple hello world example in a paragraph, this should totally work already. So it does not have to look like a field. It could be anything else. It can be any kind of HTML. It just needs to have something to render. And as soon as we did this, and we also still have our setup for the blueprint here, Kirby should already be able to load this field plugin for us. So let's see if this works. Awesome. So it now loaded the paragraph, the hello world paragraph, into our panel. And if I look at this, this is the stuff that we get in here. There's a couple more attributes being added, but so far everything's working as expected. This is nice. So next up, what I want to do is I want to use kirbyup for this plugin. I've already been using this in the blocks field as well, and I think it is just a nicer way to work on more complex plugins. What is kirbyup? Kirbyup is a tool by Johann Schoplich, who helped us come up with a really nice way to create, to work with single file components, view single file components in the or create a really nice developer experience around working with single file components for plugins. You can find it at kirbyup.getkirby.com, and if you get started here, you can find the instructions how to either install it as a dependency, a development dependency, or you can also use it with npx to instantly run it globally, which in my opinion is the easier way to get started. This is fine too. You just make up your mind what you like best. Most of the times I'm using this here. It has a couple downsides. So this version, to install it as a developer dependency is more future-proof, but I find this easier to get started with. So back to the editor, all I have to do now is to create a new package JSON and paste the code in there that I copied from the site. And so this gives me two new commands, a def command and a build command. And the second step that I have to do is now kirbyup is going to look into the source folder and there into the index.js. This means that I need to move my index.js that I've just created into the source folder. So I need to create a source folder and move the file in there. And now everything should be set up correctly, because what kirbyup does is it looks at the source file at the index.js and creates a build process around that, and then it will turn the result into the index.js for Kirby to load then as a plugin. So it can't be in the root of the plugin. And this is the only thing that you have to pay attention to when you get started with kirbyup, to move stuff into the right place, and then afterwards you're good to go. So now we should be able to run dev here. It's starting, the development server is starting, and if I open this, everything is still the same, nothing has changed, because it's still the same file that is being processed and it's still doing the same things basically. But now I have a fully working development process where I can now work with single file components. What does this mean exactly? That I no longer have to create my own templates like this in a string, but I can work with view files, and this would be the next step. So I can now create a component for my field. I like to put them into a components subfolder. And then inside my components folder, I would call this spacing field, for example. And this is important. It now needs the view file extension, because this would tell, this will turn it into a view single file component. And here I can now start writing my template code in a much nicer way, because now I have perfect syntax highlighting, and it's just a lot easier to work like this. So how do I get this back into my index.js? I can import this now here. Import spacing field from components spacing field. And then instead of having this here, I can replace it with whatever came back from the spacing field. The result should still be the same. If I look at the panel, it's still the same thing. I don't really actually have to reload this. This is just a muscle memory thing, because what kirbyup also does is it adds hot module replacement. So whenever I make changes to my single file component, it should also instantly reload those changes in the panel. So it's a really nice way to work with this. Actually, if I move this a bit over, we can see the changes immediately. So this is also giving us a bit nicer workflow here. My indentation is messed up, but this is how it is. It's not so important. So we finally set up, we can create our field. The first thing that we want to do is to wrap this in an actual field component. we have kfield, which is a custom field component that comes with a couple features built in. So for example, it already comes with a way to set up a label. So now we have a proper label. We can say this is a required field. So now it will add the asterisk to it. So it has a couple things that you want from a field or from a wrapping component for the field. And everything that we want to build now goes inside this field component. When you get started like this, it is best to pass over. No, let me move step by step. So a single file component is composed of the template part and also the script part and optionally the style part. So when I want to add logic to a component, I have to build a script block, and the script block looks like this. I'm exporting a default object here, and that object now defines my component. So for example, I can now define additional properties that this component should have. I can define methods and events and so on for this component. And if I want to style my field, I can create another style block, or I can create an additional style block and add my CSS here. So this is the beauty of single file components. I have everything in one place, and kirbyup will take care of creating a proper setup for me, or taking all the parts that it needs and put it where Kirby needs it. So it's a really nice way to work with this. Okay, one thing we want to do as the first next step here, and this is why I created the script block, is we want to extend the basic field that Kirby provides to get a few things that a field normally has. As I just showed you, you can set the label here. But of course, what we want is we want to get the label from our backend. We want to get it from the blueprint and not set it statically here, because then, we can't really change it. That wouldn't be really useful. One way, and the easiest way to do this, is to actually extend an existing field or extend our basic field. So if you say, the field that I'm building is very close to what the text field does in Kirby, you could do something like text field, and then it would inherit all the properties and methods that the text field already has. In this case, with the spacing field, I want to extend just the K field, because we want a label, we want to have a required property and a couple other things, but it's not really close to the text field, it's not really close to a number field or any other field that we have so far. It's kind of a new type. But for your field plugin, if you feel like it is very close to an existing field, then start from there. By doing that, we get a couple things built in already. We get a couple properties and stuff. And for example, to pass on the label and the required attribute, we can then do this and bind all the props that the field's component knows to the field itself. This means that it will just dump it in there, and whatever the field's component can use, it will use. This should mean that the margin label is now properly passed on from the blueprint to the field component as we see it here. And we can give that another try by going back to our blueprint whenever I find it. So here's the blueprint. We can set up a custom label, margin, spacing, whatever, just to give it a test. So now the label is already being passed on. Let's see if the required attribute also works. Yes, exactly. This is exactly what I meant. The field component already has those things built in, and as soon as we bind the properties to our component, as I just did, we don't have to care about those. So the field is already set to go. The next thing that I like to do is to add a custom class that will help with styling later. So for example, in this case, I would call it spacing field. And then this is a great way for us later to apply some styling down here. We never use scoped styles here in when we work with components. That is just a way, everything is global in Kirby. All the styles are global in Kirby. We find this to be more useful in terms of customization. So whenever you create your own custom panel CSS, it's easier than later to work with those class names and apply classes or override classes that exist for those fields. Awesome. So we are very, very close to actually do some real work now. So this is still a bit of boilerplate code that we have to take care of first, but we are getting there. Next step would be, oh, now I close it. Well, I can open it later. Next step would be to create an actual input. And of course, one thing we can do is to start with a simple native HTML text input or a number input. For a spacing value, I would probably use a number input, if I can type. So now we have an input. By default, our inputs are styled or reset completely, so they don't have any styling. We try to keep them as minimal as possible. So you have all the options to add styles on top of that. This means when you add an input, you will probably not see it at first. And this is totally normal. Just look into the source code or click through it to find it. It's just not styled. It tries to be as opaque as possible. Or as transparent, whatever. So one thing as an alternative, what you can do if you want to get the full input styling that we normally have in our other fields is to use our k-input component, because this would then wrap a lot of things around the native inputs. For example, it will apply the styles that you see now here. So we get the focus styles and the white background and the border and all that stuff. But you get also the typical things that you might want for an input, something like a text that goes before the input. So we could say this is the top margin here, and then some text that goes afterwards. Let's say we want to say that this is a pixel margin or a rem margin or whatever. So this is something that you can do. You can also apply an icon to it. So let's say, okay, text doesn't make a lot of sense here, but you get the idea. So it's not just an input, it is an extension of the input. It's adding elements to it that can help to make it a bit nicer. And all the native elements, I think we support pretty much all the native elements. I guess the file element would be one that we don't really wrap in here. But otherwise you can use this with type text, with type text area, with type number and password and email and so on and so on. And then you get this combination of the native input, but also some additional stuff on top of that. Let's leave this out for a second. For my margin input or for my spacing input, I want to have some additional attributes that will help later to make this a bit nicer. This is a number input now, so I can define the step, I can define the min and the max value that will be available or that can be entered, and that is definitely useful. So I want to say the min should be 0 and the max, I don't know, whatever, 64, whatever your maximum margin should be. And the step should be, let's say we have a design system that works in force or works with 4 units, or oh my god, what I'm talking here, you know what I mean. So it's divided by 4. Then we can use this as a step, and now I have a more useful input that is not actually doing what I want. Now it's working. So I have a bit more control over whatever is entered here. I also want to make sure that this is always filled in. So whenever this is not filled in, it will automatically give me real-time validation and mark this field as invalid. So this is a great start. But we haven't put our value in here, and we also haven't really worked with the values so far. So the first thing that we need to do is to define a new property for our field, and that would be the value. And as a value, we expect a number. So this is the way that you create properties in Vue components. You define the name of the property and then the type of the property. The type is a JavaScript type, so it would be number or string or Boolean or whatever. If you want, this is the short version. If you want to use the longer version, you could write it like this. Then it goes like this. This has the advantage that you can also define a default. So the default would be 0. From now on, we have this property defined, the value property defined, and we can use it. And this means we can now put it into our input. The value is not working. I'm talking a bit more about this in a second. The default value is not working. I'm talking a bit more about this in a second. So now we have set up our input to accept a new value. And I've skipped this because I've talked about it in the blocks video, but just to repeat it again, you might have wondered, why do I use regular attributes here for after and type, but I have those weird colon prefixed attributes for min, max, step, and required, and so on. This is a thing that is Vue specific. It means that those are dynamic values in JavaScript. So this would be anything that comes from a variable, for example, but it also applies to native types. So for example, numbers or Booleans or whatever, you have to use the colon as a prefix to tell the component this is a number attribute, and it's not just passing 0 as a string to the component. Whenever you use this without the colon, Vue.js would then think this is a simple string and would apply it as a string attribute, which is not really useful in most of the cases. But this is especially important when you work with variables, because then you have to pass it like this. Another specialty here is that I'm using value without this, for example, because this is a part of what Vue.js does in template code. You don't have to use this referencing the component object. It's just not necessary within the template code. The same goes for props here, for example. There are a couple keywords like props or attributes, attributes that are additional special things in Vue.js. If you want to know more about them, please check out the Vue docs. I'm also going to talk a bit more about them in following videos and also probably in this video, but the Vue docs are really great. Just make sure that you go to the Vue 2 docs, because this is all still Vue 2.js. We are working on support for Vue 3, which is the most recent version, but they only differ in certain places. If you are coming from a Vue 3 background, you should feel familiar here, and the other way around. So just make sure that you get the right docs when you look for them. Okay, let's continue. So we have the value in here, and what do we do now? There is no value yet, nothing has been stored yet. Let's just make a small experiment. If we go to our content folder and to our demo.txt, yes, I want to open it. We can already put a field in here. Let me check. Sorry, I'm jumping around a bit. Let me go in here. So I used margin as the key. This means if I create a margin field and I put in 12, for example, this should be now the value for the margin field. And by extending the field component, that value should already be passed on to our field. So whenever we put something into the text file, it will already be loaded. It will already be passed as a property to our Vue component and will be now available in our input. So this is pretty cool already, because it kind of works. it feels a bit like magic when it appears there for the first time, and we can change it in the text file and it will change here as well. And this is nice. So one way is already working. Our backend is already communicating with our view component. It's already putting the value in here. But if I change that value now, nothing happens. Normally we should expect the save button to appear, and this does not happen. So no changes in our input are propagating properly to the form. The panel does not know that something changed yet. And if I save the page, the value should also not change in the back. Let's give that a quick try. Go back to our text file, and it's still 8 in here, and it's still 4 in the front end. And so this is it's not really working. This means that we have to tell our form that something has happened whenever this input changes. And we can do this with an event. And each input has an input event. This is like adding an input event handler on a native element. It's nothing else. You just tell whenever an input event is fired, do something, please. This is what the add the add prefix is for. It tells Vue.js that this is an event handler. So those are the 3 attribute types that you have to keep in mind. The ones with the colons for dynamic properties, the regular ones, and then the event handlers. So now what we could do is we can emit something. This is another keyword. As I said before, props is one of those keywords in a template. Emit is one of those, or in a Vue component. There's attributes and there's options, I think, and there's, I don't know. I think those are the most important ones. So we're basically using a built-in emit function in Vue.js to send the event further up the chain and tell the form something is happening here. The emit function gets a first argument, which would be an event again. So we tell the form that something has happened by sending an input event. And as a second argument, we can send a value for this field now. And we could say foo, and then this value would always be foo, which is not really helpful. If we want to use the whatever comes out of the input event from the input component, we can use another magic keyword, which is event. So that would be taking whatever came out of this input event handler and pass it further on to the form. It's all a bit magic on first sight, but it's not too complicated the more you work with it, and it's actually really powerful. So let me check if this actually works, because that would be kind of cool. Going back to the field, if we start changing stuff, you saw that the reword and save buttons appeared. That is a good sign, because the form already realized, okay, there are some changes. If we reword it, it should, okay, we started with 8 and we're going back to 8. That is not really magic. If we should reword it, it should also revert. So this is working great. So something's working here. Our input event is obviously recognized. And when we save the form, and if we go back to the text file, you can see the value has already been updated. This is pretty nice because we haven't done any kind of backend code for all of this yet. This is how our backend code for our field looks like. We don't have to do this. If you really just pass on regular values, you send a string or a number or anything back to the backend, and it comes back from the backend like this, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to define anything. This is basically coming out of the box for free. Nice. So our field is working already. We don't have to do anything else. We could stop here and say, this is a nice margin field. Let's go home and be happy. But of course, our initial idea was to do something that is a bit more like this. And of course, this is a lot more complex. So let's get back to work. This would be great for a single value. And now it gets a bit more complicated because we can't store a single value. We want basically an object of values. I like to go back to the drawing bored at this point and think a bit more about what do we want to store, what do we want to do with it later in the template, for example, and like how should it look like. And most of the times I really like to go back to the text file and think about what kind of value I want to store in here. So far it's just a number, totally fine. Yeah, it's totally enough if it would be a simple field like this. But later what I want to store actually is a top margin, a right margin, a left margin, and a bottom margin. Something like this. Okay, they should be divisible by 4. Let's pretend we have this. So I like to pretend that it is already working in this way. How do we store values in a text file that are structured? Most of the times we can either go for JSON or we can go for YAML. If it's simple data like this, YAML is a lot easier than storing JSON in here. And Kirby has a couple built-in ways to work with YAML, which make it quite easy to create YAML, but also pass YAML in when we're working with such fields. So this is the perfect structure, in my opinion, for such a margin field. Going to the template as a next step, how would we use such a margin field? Because that would be the next interesting question. Is this actually useful? Because otherwise a field like this would not be, we shouldn't be working on a field if it does not help us to build the templates that we want to build. So as a next step of building the concept of such a field, just think about how would you end up using it in a template. We can simply put this into the default template. Again, I'm pretending here that everything is already working. The text is, the margins are already stored in my text file, and now I want to use them in a template. How would I do that? Well, I could do something like this and then say, okay, margin top, margin left, whatever. Basically, looking at the result of what comes out of my field. My field was called margin. I like to start with a simple dump helper function to give me the result of that. If I open this in the browser, this is how it looks like. So I get stuff that is not super useful, that it is not really structured so far. Kirby still thinks that this is a string at this point. But one built-in field method that we can use is the YAML method, and that will turn it into a simple array. So now we have structured content, and from here on we can say, okay, I get my top margin. This is cool because now I have something that is actually already usable out of the box. So I could say, let's turn this into an echo statement, and now I get the top margin. Okay, I wouldn't probably end up like this, but you get the idea. So I can start prototyping certain kind of concepts here and think like, is this actually getting me somewhere? Is this useful as a result? And I feel like, yeah, this could work. Okay, so the idea to store it in a structured format like this, then parse the YAML and get individual values for each margin, that is a great idea. Cool. So this means we already know what kind of value we want to store. But coming back to our field, we know that this is not working because the value so far is only a number. We have to turn this into an object now, and this is where it gets a lot more tricky than it has been so far. But don't be afraid, I'm taking you through it step by step. Now at this point we need a bit of backend code because so far Kirby has been taking over for us. It has been storing, or it has been giving us a value property. It has been loading that from the demo.txt and passing it on to the front end. Okay, I'm taking things apart here again just to give you a simpler look at how those things interact. Let's comment this out for a second and only display the value in here. So this is the value that we get from the backend. We can wrap that in a code block to make it look a bit nicer. This is a simple trick that I'm using sometimes just to visualize what kind of value I'm getting here. So now I see this a bit better. Why do I get the 40 back here? That's a good question. No, I'm not getting the 40 back here. I'm getting the value. The value was still stored in I haven't reloaded the panel basically, so there was still the 40. This is making a lot more sense. I'm getting the stuff back from here. But this is just a string. It's not structured data, even if it looks like this. It's just a string value. So this means that our backend has to turn the string value that is coming from the text file into structured data first. And how we do we do this in a field definition? Part of the field definition on the backend, similarly to the front end, is that we can define certain props to work with. Most of the props that we get from our blueprint, like the label or the type or something, are automatically passed on if we don't work with them. But we can create our own properties and then do a bit more with those. So we use the props key here, and then within the props key, we can say we define what happens to our value. What kind of value is being sent to the front end? And so, for example, what we can do is completely bypass what is coming from the text file and send our own value here. If we do this, as you see, it has just reloaded. It is passing the string that we return here in our value function to the panel, to our component. So now from here on, we can also return an array, of course. Arrays in PHP are objects in JavaScript if they are keyed. If they are associative, non-associative arrays, they are also arrays in JavaScript. That is a bit of a mind bender sometimes. You have to keep that in mind. Okay, let's pretend that we have already structured margin content here. Top, no, always mix up the order. Top right, bottom left. Okay, it's not reloading. Now it's, I don't know, sometimes it's loading, sometimes it's not. So you can see this PHP array with keys here is turning into a proper JavaScript array. This is super cool because this is exactly what we want. We want to have a JavaScript object that we can use later to pass on to multiple inputs. Perfect. But so far we have just created a custom static array. It's not coming from the backend. It's not super useful. Okay. How do we get stuff from the backend now in our props function? By passing in value, and the default result is always null because the field could be empty still. Okay. Now at this point, whatever is in our demo.txt, this kind of stuff here will be in this variable and we can work with it from this point on. But it's still a string. It's still, if we dump it here, yeah, it's masterclass debugging, but super easy to do because you can dump it and then the panel will stop displaying the entire panel and just give you the value, which I think is still the most easy way to go forward. You can see it is giving us the result of the text file, but it is still a string. So we somehow have to parse it. How do we parse it? Kirby has a built-in YAML parser, which looks like this. So we can write YAML : decode, and that should turn our string stuff from the field into a proper array that we need. Awesome, it's working. So we get our margins here already. We don't have to dump them anymore. And now what I like to do at this point is to use a default setup, the default values that we want to pass, and merge them with the stuff that we got from the backend. Because if nothing is in the field yet, we still want to have top, right, bottom, and left, but only defined as null. So by merging those two arrays, we can make sure that this is always the default, but then our values from the text file come on top of that. Whew, that was quite a lot, but the result is working. So we get our object back in the panel. We have a connection to our text file. We can change stuff here, and it should also still appear in the panel. Yes, it works. And if that's the nice part about merging it, if we remove the top margin from the field now, for example, it is still there because our backend code is still setting it as a default. Great. So we have a connection between the text file and the front end. Keep in mind, all of this is only complicated because we're working with objects now in this case, or it's a bit more complicated, and I'm explaining it quite, extensively. If you work with single values, it's all super easy. Okay, cool. But it's not getting a lot more complicated than this, because this is basically all the backend code that we need. Here comes a neat little thing. If we submit the value again later, Kirby will automatically turn arrays. If we send arrays to the backend, Kirby will automatically turn those into YAML by default. We can change that if we want, but this will be the default behavior. Otherwise, Kirby wouldn't be able to store it for us. And this means we only have to take care about loading stuff properly into the panel. We don't have to care about saving it later. Okay. But let's move on. So we have our value, it is an object, and this means from now on we can have multiple inputs. This is basically what we want. Reminding ourselves, this is kind of what we want to end up with in a simplified version. We need 4 inputs and not just 1. So working a bit more on the template code here, I'm going to change this a bit now, because I don't want to pass in the entire object as value. I want to pass just one part of it, one margin value in here. So in this case, the top value. We can now use, for example, our before attribute here to say this is the top margin. This is already quite nice. We have to change this again as well later, but it's not necessary yet. Okay, so now we can copy this 4 times. I hate that my editor is messing up the indentation. Let's revert that quickly. It's easier to read like that. So we can say top, right, bottom, and then also left. Does it work? Yes, nice. So we already have the values in our inputs, in 4 inputs. Let's just give it a quick try. If the left value changes, perfect. So this is great. It's getting along quite well. I want to also make sure that the style is nice, because I'm a weird design nerd and I want to make it look nice. So I'm going to wrap this in another div. At this point, I'm a bit annoyed about the indentation. The tab space is too wide. I don't know why this is messed up, but yeah, nothing too serious. So with the new div, we can apply a bit of grid to it. And now it's starting to look like something. It's starting to look like something that Twizy, or I hope I pronounced the name correct, is looking for. Cool. With a bit of gap, the inputs look nice and tidy. That's great. Cool. So we have our inputs ready. And as I said before, we have to work on this, because now the input event is doing something that makes no sense at all. It is sending the top value, for example, in our first input as the value for the field. So that would override the entire object with just one value. And with every other input, the same would happen. So it's completely wrong. We have to make sure that each input only overrides that part of the margin. The best way to do this is to define a custom method. We can do this by saying on input, do something. And as a first argument, we can now say this should modify the top margin. And as the second argument, we want to send the value. We can use the magic event keyword again. Then this would override the right margin. This would override the bottom margin. And this would override the left margin. Okay, now we have to define this method because it doesn't exist yet. We can do this in our component code with the methods object, and here create a new function, and that or new method, of course. First argument would be the margin, or whatever the position, or what do you call it? Margin, position. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And the value as a second argument. Okay, sometimes, again, like super smart ways to debug stuff, I like to just simply use console log. Open this up and see if we did this in the right way. Let's see what happens. So top, right, and bottom is changing as correctly. There seems to be a weird. It's coming from our debouncing probably. No, I don't know why this is happening. That's weird. Okay, but I think we should be fine at this point. Cool. So we have our input and our input method, and now we have to make sure that we somehow create a new, or that we emit a new input event. Inside such a method, we can call emit like this. So we have to use this in this case, in contrast to the template space where we don't have to use this, but the methods stay the same, or the keywords stay the same. So we send an input event and we want to send a new value. And that new value should be the object, the value object, with just that one value being replaced. How do we do this? Let's create a proper new object first. That new value would be a combination of the existing one. And then we want to override just that one margin here. We can't use it like this, because then this would be literally margin in the final object. But we can't. This is dynamic, so we want to make sure that this is overriding top, left, bottom, right, and we can do this with this notation in JavaScript, which is quite handy because now it is a dynamic key that is being replaced with whatever comes in here as a variable. And to make sure that we're doing everything right here, let's master debug this some more. Okay, this is great. So our object is properly being updated as we expect it to be updated. And this means we can remove the comment here and pass it to the input event. And that's pretty much all we need to do. Now, from here on, the input value will be the full object with all the margins, top, right, bottom, left. And that's the nice part about it, about the panel setup. In contrast to, for example, a native form in HTML objects, you can't simply pass an object, or you can't simply send an object to the backend in JavaScript or in native HTML without some extra work. And here it really works out of the box. So we can just emit an object in the input event, and then this will end up Kirby will recognize the changes, you can revert the changes, and it will also be sent to the backend correctly. And as I said before, from here on we don't really have to do anything else. Kirby will take over and convert that object back to YAML for us and store it in the field for us. So the only thing that we really had to do was to pass the value as we did before in our PHP file, and the rest is handled for us. So now everything, well, wait, this is not updated. Wait. Okay, so it seems that there is obviously a caching issue here in the preview because it's working as expected. I don't know what I did wrong, but you see it's working. No last minute issues here. That's good. Okay, I think it was just a preview. Sometimes the preview is stuck in the previous version. Cool. So we have a fully functioning spacing field. We kept it pretty reusable. So if we want to also take care of the padding, we could have just another one of those. Call it padding. And of course, it doesn't look as nice as the one from the Discord example so far. But I mean, this is just a styling issue, right? So arranging it in a box and then giving it additional styles would be not the hardest part from here on. We could totally do this. So now we have padding and margin being stored, and we can use it in our template as I showed you before. We have the concept how to convert it back. We could even create a field method around it to make it a bit easier to turn it into a full margin chain or something like that. That would also be possible. So there are lots of additional options that you can build on top of this now at this point. I think it's an interesting use case because such object fields are sometimes really just the only way to handle stuff. So sometimes an object needs to be sent to the backend, and so it was a great example to show you how this works. I hope you could take a lot out of it and you weren't too intimidated by it. I know there are a few things that you just have to wrap your head around when you've built your first plugin, but there comes a lot of power with it. And looking at the code again, the backend part and the front-end part isn't too bad. So it is really not a lot of code that you have to look into to get this working. And I just hope that you had fun with it and that you have ideas how to build your own fields on, after this tutorial. If you have questions, contact us via the comments. If you like the tutorials, please subscribe. We like it a lot that we see a lot more subscribers in the last few weeks. And you can also join us on Discord and ask questions there. Thank you very much for watching. This was a longer one. See you next time. Bye bye.